Good morning and good afternoon. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2020 Global Public HR Conference, co-organized by the National HR Development Institute, the Korean Society for Public Personnel Administration, and the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to extend my gratitude to all the panelists and participants from home and abroad for taking time to stay with us and participate in this conference. My name is Ji-Yeon Kim, and I'm very honored to be the MC for this very important event. To give you an overview of today's conference, we will start off with an opening ceremony, followed by a plenary session and 3 individual sessions. Due to social distancing measures against the spread of COVID-19, this conference is being held remotely online. We are providing English and Korean simultaneous interpretation service, and it is broadcast live on YouTube. For those of you joining us online, please select your language of choice. This on-site venue where we're gathered was prepared by strictly abiding by COVID-19 preventive measures, and this will continue until the end of conference. With this, let us now begin the 2020 Global Public HR Conference under the theme of Public HR, Embrace the Future. First and foremost, please allow me to invite Ms. Park Chun-nan, the president of NHI, for her opening remarks. Please greet her to the stage with a big round of applause.
네, 존경하는 내외 기빈 여러분,
Distinguished guests,
안녕하십니까?
good morning and good afternoon.
국가공무원인재개발원장 박출란입니다.
I'm Park Chun-nan, the
국내외
president of
HR 전문가분들을
NHI.
모시고
It is such a great pleasure to hold the
global
2020 Global Public HR Conference online with all the HR experts from home and abroad.
먼저 이 행사를 위해
I would like
함께
to extend my
수고해 주신
sincere gratitude to President Kwon Yong-soo of the Korean Society for Public Personnel Administration and President Yoo Jong-il of KDI School of Public Policy and Management for co-hosting this conference. My special thanks go to Minister Hwang Seo-jong of the Ministry of Personnel Management for his unsparing support for this event. I also want to thank distinguished Professor Emeritus James Perry of Indiana University and Honorary Professor Andrew Poser of Australian National University, as well as former Public Service Commissioner for taking time out of busy schedules to deliver keynote speech, and Professor Choi Yong-seok of Korea University, who will be the chair of the session. I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to the speakers and chairs, as well as all those who are joining us via online. Thank you. The spread of COVID-19 has changed and challenged the way of work and the way of life throughout the world, restricting movement and in-person meetings. Against this backdrop, it is even more significant to have this non-face-to-face conference on the strategies and directions for public HR to lead us into the new future. Distinguished guests, the pandemic has brought about colossal waves of changes, unprecedented in size and pace, to the whole world. Digital transformation, which would have taken years, is done over several months. COVID-19 expedites the transition into non-face-to-face digital society, changing everything in this society so rapidly. With this trend underlying the changes, we are experiencing the innovation and innovative transition into digital world triggered by COVID-19, represented by AI, robotics, automation, and non-face-to-face society. This calls for the necessity of the competency and capabilities to be braced for various changes in the environment and to look into the uncertain future. Furthermore, it has become essential to establish and implement innovative HR system and HRD strategies to grow and
이러한
nurture talents
측면에서
with
올해
capabilities
컨퍼런스
to lead
주제인
social
공공
changes.
HR,
In that sense, the
미래를
theme of
품다는
today's conference,
글로벌
Public
환경과
HR
시대
Embrace the
변화에
Future, is
공헌
very
매우
significant and
시의적절하고
meaningful
의미 있는
that responds
주제라고
to the
생각합니다.
changes in the global
HR
environment and
전문가로서
the time.
우리는 시대가
As
요구하는
HR
흐름을
experts,
가장
we
먼저
are
읽고
obliged to
시대를
read
선도해
the
나가야 할
change
것입니다.
required by
이에
the time
발맞추어
and lead
국가공무원
the
인재개발원
time.
또한
In line with this,
다양한
the National
에듀테크 기술을
Human
적용하여
Resources
온
Development
오프라인
Institute has
교육의
continuously
융합을
developed and
도모하고
applied new
새로운
education
교육
models and
모델과
methods, pursuing
방식을
the integration between
끊임없이
offline and online
개발하고
education,
적용하는 등
and applying
인재개발
various
혁신을 위한
education
노력을
technologies in order to
경주하고
realize
있습니다.
HRD
존경하는
innovation.
참석자 여러분,
Distinguished
이
guests,
자리에
we
모인
are tasked
우리에게는
with a
뉴노멀 시대의
mission to
미래를
prepare for the
대비하고
future of new
급격한
normal
사회의
and to
변화
be a focal
속에서
point for development
발전과
and a
도약의
leap amidst
구심점이
dramatic
되어야
social
하는
changes.
사명이 있습니다. 그러나 이 사명을
The journey to
완수하는
accomplishing
길은
this
쉽지
mission
않은
will not be
여정이
easy.
될 것입니다. 그렇지만
However,
여러 쓰인
as the
말이
saying,
쇠도
the words of
녹인다라는
many even
말이
melt the
있듯이
iron
여러
goes,
사람이 함께
if we
모여
put our
지혜를
collective wisdom
합친다면
together,
불확실한
we will
미래의
successfully
여정을
navigate through
잘
this
헤쳐 나갈 수
uncertain
있을
time.
것이라고 굳게 믿고 있습니다. 이번 컨퍼런스를
I hope
통해
this conference
우리 모두
serves as an
공공
opportunity to
HR
share
전략과
ideas
미래
and
대응
thoughts,
방향을
as well
모색하기 위한
as insight
다양한
to find
고민과
strategies and directions
아이디어를
for public
공유하고
HR.
또한 의미 있는
I
시간들을
hope you will find
나누기를
this conference
기대합니다.
informative
끝으로 다시
and
한번 오늘
inspiring.
이 자리에
Once again,
함께해
thank you
주신
for honoring us
모든
with your
분들께
presence,
감사드리고
and I
유익한
wish
시간이
every
되시길
good luck
바랍니다.
and
그리고
success to
코로나19로
you
인해
and
여러모로
your family.
어려움이 많으시겠지만 여러분들의 가정과 직장에 늘 건강과 행복이 함께하시길 기원하겠습니다.
Thank you.
감사합니다.
Let's give her a big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you, President Park, for the warm and informative remarks. Next, let us invite Mr. Kwon Yong-soo, the president of KOSPPA, for his welcoming remarks. Please give him a big hand.
네, 안녕하십니까. 한국인사행정학회
So good morning. I am Kwon Yong-soo. I'm the
2020년
president of the COSPA. I would like to congratulate you on the opening of the 2020 Global Public HR Conference and welcome all of you who are joining us at home and abroad. It is my sincere wish that today's conference will give us a meaningful opportunity to navigate our thoughts on the future of HR with researchers and policy experts. So I hope that it could be a very good opportunity for us to discuss where it should evolve, what kind of key tasks we have to perform. I also expect that there will be a lot of illuminating presentations and discussions of theories and policy experiences in public HR. Globally, the public sector has the largest number of employees. And also, it is the key pillar for our national development. And therefore, the importance of securing, developing, utilizing, and retaining public human resources has been strongly emphasized. In the future, in order to fulfill very important responsibilities of the public sectors, visions and strategies of public HR should constantly be under scrutiny and also be changed. And this is where the global cooperation and sharing is critically needed. In particular, the cooperation and exchanges in public HR will contribute not only to an individual nation, but also to co-prosperity for the entire international community. I'd like to share with you my expectation toward the 2020 Global Public HR Conference in my speech. First, I hope that this conference will become an opportunity to muster our wisdom and insights, to explore visions, values, and strategies of public HR to prepare us for the future society. To this end, the eminent scholars at home and abroad in public HR sectors will present their valuable views and perspectives. regarding what public HR can contribute to the society. And the conference will also give us an insight on how public HR should embrace various disciplines, including humanities, social science, natural science, and engineering technologies, to realize the values and prosperity that humanity has pursued. Second, the conference will give us a chance to discuss various tasks that public HR should be prepared for the future. In particular, we have to beef up our efforts to diagnose, develop, and strengthen the capacities for public HR. Third, today's conference, I hope, will serve us as a venue to promote the sort of the enlargement of the global public HR community. Through global public HR community, experiences in public HR can be shared and learned, and cooperation can also be generated. Especially, I hope that the conference will be a valuable chance to introduce Korea's public HR examples to the global society. With Global Public HR Conference held for years now, interest and efforts to improve public HR have been intensified. I sincerely hope that the conference will also set a model for other policy sectors in public HR. And I would like to express my sincere appreciation to scholars from home and abroad who will share their valuable insights and experiences today. And last but not least, I would like to thank the National Human Resources Development Institute, Ministry of the Personnel Management, and also the KDI and COSPA for their efforts to put together this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Hwang, for the meaningful remarks. Last but not least, we will listen to Mr. Hwang Seo-jong, the Minister of Personnel Management, on his congratulatory remarks. Due to prior commitments, Minister Hwang was not able to join us here, therefore sent us his message through video. Please turn your attentions to the video.
안녕하십니까. 인사혁신처처장 황서종입니다. 먼저 올해로 8회째를 맞은 2020 글로벌 공공 HR 컨퍼런스 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 온라인을 통하여 세계 각지에서 참석하고 계신 국내 HR 전문가와 각국 정부 관계자 여러분들께도 환영의 말씀을 드립니다. 오늘 이 자리를 준비해 주신 국가공무원인재개발원 박출란 원장님, 한국인사행정학회 권영수 학회장님, KDI 국제정책대학원 유종일 원장님을 비롯한 관계자 여러분께도 깊이 감사드립니다. 또한 기조 강연을 위해 각각 호주와 미국에서 함께해 주신 제임스 페리 교수님과 앤드류 포저 교수님께도 특별한 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 오늘 컨퍼런스에 참석하신 모든 분들에게 통찰과 영감을 선사해 주시길 기대합니다. HR 전문가 여러분, 지금 전 세계는 전대미문의 감염병 위기에 직면하고 있습니다. 코로나19로 인해 촉발된 비대면,
With the outbreak
비접촉
of the
사회는
COVID-19,
우리의
contactless,
삶을 빠른 속도로
non-face-to-face interaction
변화시켰고
is now penetrating
이제는
into every
코로나
aspect of our
시대의
lives
새로운
at a very
표준으로
rapid pace,
자리 잡고
including
있습니다.
society, economy, culture, and education, and it has
아울러
become a new part
DNA,
of our
즉
day-to-day lives,
데이터,
represented
네트워크,
by DNA,
AI로
or
대표되는
data,
디지털
network,
기술은
and AI.
4차
Digital
산업혁명과
technologies are now
비대면
converging
디지털
and
사회로의
facilitating the
전환을
transformation
더욱
into Industry 4.0,
가속화시키고 있습니다.
as well as the arrival of the
HR
contactless
전문가
digital
여러분,
society.
당연하다고
Distinguished guests,
생각했던 소중한
today what has
일상을
been normal
잃어버린
becomes no
지금은
longer
분명
normal, and this massive
우리에게
change by
큰
itself is a
위기입니다.
big crisis for us.
가만히 멈추어
Yet,
있을
we
수만은
should not
없습니다.
stand idly by.
단절과
We have to
고립을
overcome
넘어설 수
isolation
있는
and disconnection,
새로운
and we have to
연결과
find out the
접촉의
way
방식을
for new
찾아
connection and new
앞으로의
interactions in
미래에
order to prepare ourselves
대비해야
for the upcoming
합니다.
future of this new normal.
지금 이 순간은
We
위기의
should
시간인
never
동시에
forget that now is a
새로운
time for
가능성을
change,
준비하는
challenge, but it
기회의
is also
시간이라는
a
사실을
time for opportunity
잊어서는 안
to
됩니다.
prepare us for new
이러한
possibility.
시기에 세계
At this
각국의
critical juncture,
HR
it is meaningful
전문가분들과
and timely
함께
appropriate to have this
머리를
conference,
맞대고
bringing together
공공
HR
HR의
experts all around the
미래를
world
대비하기
to
위한
seek
인재
for the
개발
HR development
전략을 논의하는
strategies
것은 매우
for the future
시적절하고
of public
의미
HR.
있는 일이라고 생각합니다. 특히
In
공공
particular, the
HR에서의
themes of today's
다양성
conference,
관리와
managing
미래
diversity
역량
and
강화라는
strengthening future
주제는
capacity.
새로운 미래를
These are particularly
준비하기에
important in
반드시
public HR,
짚고 넘어가야 할
which makes our
부분이라는
conference
점에서
even more
그
meaningful.
의미가 더욱 큽니다. HR 전문가 여러분,
Distinguished guests,
대한민국 정부는
the government of
포스트
Korea,
코로나
in order
시대를
to usher in
대비하기
a
위한
new post-COVID
국가 전략인
era, is now
한국판 뉴딜
pursuing digital
정책을
New Deal
추진하고
as a
있습니다.
part of the nationwide Korean New Deal
여기에는
program.
지능형
And
정부 구축을
building an
포함한
intelligent
디지털
government
뉴딜 사업도
is a key
포함되어
pillar of
있습니다.
this initiative.
이에 발맞춰
Keeping pace
인사혁신처도
with this government
지능형
effort, the
인재개발 플랫폼
MPM
사업을
is now
시작으로
aggressively pursuing
인사혁신 전반의 디지털 전환을
the digital-based
추진하고 있습니다.
innovation in personnel management
공무원의 디지털 역량을 향상시키고
in order to
각 인사
strengthen the
분야의
capacities
디지털
of
기반을
the
구축하기 위해
public officers.
인사혁신처 전
and
직원이
the
함께
MPM
고민하고
is
있습니다.
now pursuing various
오늘
ways.
컨퍼런스에서 앞으로
I sincerely
공공
hope that
HR이
today's conference
준비해야 할
will
부분에 대한
serve us as a
생산적인
platform to take an
논의가
in-depth
이루어지고
look in various
의미 있는
aspects of public
성과도
HR
거둘
to
수
build a better
있기를
future.
기대합니다. 다시 한번
Once again,
2020
I would like to
글로벌
congratulate you
공공
on the
HR
opening of
컨퍼런스
this
개최를
conference.
진심으로 축하드립니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Huang, for your insightful remarks. We will now close the opening ceremony and move on to the plenary session. Please allow me to introduce the two distinguished keynote speakers who are joining us online. We have with us today Mr. Andrew Podger, former Public Service Commissioner and currently a professor at Australian National University. Also joining us is Mr. James Perry, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Indiana University. Please put your hands together to welcome the two professors. Thank you very much for your time. The first keynote speaker of today is Professor Andrew Podger. He will speak about building public sector capability for the future, a view from Australia. Professor Podger, the floor is yours. Professor Podger, excuse me, I think we have lost you in terms of sound. Could you please give us a second?
My fault.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank-
Please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you to the organizers of this conference and for the invitation for me to speak this morning. I'm also pleased that my friend Jim Perry is joining me on this panel. He is a genuine and esteemed academic. I am really a practitioner turned academic late in my career. In this presentation, you'll see on my slides that I often have words in red which highlight the key themes that I believe are critical to the civil service of the future and for HRM in the public sector more generally. But let me start with an overview of developments internationally in public administration. Next slide. Next slide. Over the last 40 years, we've seen some major international trends. There was the wide influence of new public management starting from the 1980s through to the 2000s. Different countries approached this in different ways, adapting it to their local arrangements. And some countries took it as very ideological, other countries like Australia, much more in a pragmatic way. But the main thoughts were management for results, an emphasis on efficiency, using market-type mechanisms like contracting out, commercialisation and privatisation, and devolving management authority. From late 1990s into the 2000s, a few concerns were beginning to be raised about new public management that it was too vertical. And so the idea was to move to more what was called new public governance of whole of government or horizontal management, about networking not only across government but beyond government, and thinking about bottom-up as well as top-down accountability and citizen-centred services. This shift wasn't to throw out new public management, but to modify it in important ways. Next slide. We're not quite sure what the next trend will be, and various writers have been talking about different directions we might take. Perhaps there will be wider variations across nations relating to the shifts in the global order that we're all seeing. There's also a lot of concern still about some of the negative impacts of new public management, even though there have been successes in improved efficiency. There's a lot of pressure of new technology for more integrated services, and that may become an increasing theme. There are also public expectations of personalised services and choice, and some writers are saying there might be more decentering, that is, more centres of power, more localism in the way public service goes. So we're still waiting to see what the new trend might be. But whatever trend that is, a number of implications for the civil service are already arising. The first is public sector capability is getting more attention. That there is a concern that maybe new public management and new public governance have reduced internal capabilities on the assumption that we can find capabilities outside. But it's also because we need new skills and capabilities. There's also a concern that we may have lost sight of the importance of the civil service roles and values, that perhaps we've allowed in new public management and our other arrangements excessive political control and not reiterating the importance of values of the public service like merit-based employment, impartiality, and commitment to public service. And the other civil service implication that seems to be coming through is the importance of collaboration and connectedness. Next slide. Let's have a quick look at COVID-19 as whether that gives us any indication of these things. Interestingly, around the world, in most countries, in addressing COVID-19, there's been recognition of the importance of expertise within the public sector, the importance of chief medical officers, processes for rapid evaluation and learning within the public sector, not just drawing on external help. There's been confirmation of the importance of horizontal management, including intergovernmental collaboration and the connectedness working together. At the same time, local management has proven to be essential, particularly on things like contact tracing and things of that sort to address the COVID-19. That local management, however, has required national policies and national resources to assist. We've also seen the importance of new technology, not only in the direct area of how to manage COVID, such as clever technology to do the contact tracing, but also, given the restrictions, using new technology across the economy for new ways for people to work. Next slide. Let me talk about a couple of Australian developments more generally. Over the last decade, we've had a number of reviews of public administration here. I won't go through each of them in turn. They've had mixed quality. Some of them have been very good, but some of them have made some very important recommendations that haven't been accepted. But these reports have influenced significant developments in public sector management and capability in Australia. Next slide. For example, there were very significant changes in financial management within our public sector. A new legislation was passed called the Public Governance, Accountability and Performance Act in 2014. This was important not only in setting the principles for governance and accountability across the Commonwealth, that is the national government, but it specifically requires collaboration across the national government and beyond the national government. It also mandated corporate plans by every agency to complement its annual performance management system. The corporate plans give emphasis to capability for future performance, not only capability for current performance. There was strengthening of performance reporting and more systematic risk management. A review of the implementation of that Act suggested that we've made some progress, but we've got a long way to go, particularly around the corporate planning side and performance reporting, and trying to improve the capability of the service. Next slide. The Public Service Act was also amended at this time, strengthening the role of the Central Public Service Commission. It established what is called the Secretaries Board. That is, the secretaries are the equivalent in Korea of your vice ministers. And they were made responsible under the legislation for the stewardship of the public service and for collaboration. The word stewardship is very much about sustaining the capability of the public service. The legislation also made each departmental secretary responsible for the stewardship of their departments. Secretaries and the whole senior executive service were required to do a lot more in collaboration. And there was a re-articulation of the values of the public service to make sure that everybody understood them a lot more, what those values were. Around that time, all agencies were subject to a capability review. This used some United Kingdom methodology, trying to look at the capability of organisations related to leadership strategy and delivery. I won't go through the details of that, but let me move on to what's happened since then. Next slide. Next slide. Since the most recent report last year, there's a lot more emphasis again on collaboration and a retreat from devolution, strengthening the role of that new Secretaries Board, which is chaired by the Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department, and strengthening again the Public Service Commission, and pushing more for agile operation across the public service. There's also been a decision by government to invest a lot more in the capability of the public service. Two things I want to highlight from there are the professions model to build public service-wide career paths for key professions, including in HRM, digital skills, data and statistics, and procurement. Capability reviews are also to be reintroduced. But the second thing I want to highlight is the investment into IT, which is likely to be very substantial. Next slide. There will also be a much more emphasis on integrated service delivery using new technology. A new organisation called Services Australia has been established as an executive agency, and there's a lot of support for seamless service delivery across government, including in the tax system, in border control, in the health system, a whole range of areas looking for a seamless, citizen-centred service delivery model. There are some important omissions in this which disappoint me, in that there are still too tough budget controls over the public service. There are still too many staffing limits, giving too much emphasis to contracting out, and the role and professional independence of the public service has not been addressed. Next slide. Looking at the COVID experience, nonetheless, you can see we have drawn on the things that happened, and that it has been illustrated very firmly that we're on the right direction. The lead role of the National Cabinet, which the heads of the national and state governments they've taken charge of our response. The Secretaries Board has been extremely active in coordinating action across agencies, and the Public Service Commissioner has also been redeploying staff across the public service to address pressure areas. There's been clear reliance on public sector experts, not only in the health area, but also in other areas, such as the Treasury Secretary has been far more prominent in addressing issues of our response economically to the COVID-19. Next slide. There's also been a lot of use of technology in the COVID response. We use an app to assist with contact tracing. Hasn't been quite as successful as hoped, but we are learning to improve it. But more generally, broadband investment across the country over the last decade has proven to be critical in allowing remote working across the country during all the restrictions, and it is including within the public service, that the public service has been able to operate away from the office with a reasonable success because of the technology available. The results in Australia, like Korea, have been pretty successful internationally, though we have made a few mistakes. The issue now is how do we handle the economic impact, which is huge. We have taken quick action to protect those worst affected, but there's a lot more work to be done. Next slide. A few final observations. This COVID response, some people talk about it being a new normal. Maybe it'll be new normal in some areas, but I don't think we should take it too far because COVID is an extreme case of crisis management, and a new normal has to come out of what we do, not only in crises, but in general normal public administration. But 3 Australian developments have been reinforced in the COVID. The first one is the importance of taking full advantage of new technology. The second one is that collaboration and connectedness is clearly going to be the way we have to operate into the future. And the third one is building and rebuilding capability within the public sector, not just using contracting out and expertise outside, but building the capability inside is going to be critical. Exactly how to do it is still a little unclear. There are some obvious areas of balancing to get right. When we talk about collaboration, the downside is it does blur responsibilities and can lead to people trying to shift blame and not take accountability properly. There's the issue of getting the right mix between what you want as internal expertise and when you contract out. We will continue to use contracting out, but I think we have to put more emphasis on our own internal expertise. And when we talk about internal expertise, getting the right mix of specialist and generalist skills is important. I think the one weakness in the Australian response is we have not strengthened the civil service role as an institution sufficiently. The partisan politics are still undermining the values of impartiality, merit, and commitment to public service. Let me end there.
Thank you very much, Professor Podger, for this very informative presentation on building public sector capability and its implications regarding the outbreak of COVID-19. Thank you. Let us now invite Professor James Perry, who will speak about managing organizations to sustain passion for public service. Professor Perry, please take the floor. Professor Perry, are you with us?
Unmute, okay.
Right, great.
I was saying that it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening in my part of the world, morning in Seoul. 안녕하세요 to everyone. I don't know the languages of others who might be involved, but hopefully I gave the appropriate greeting to my friends from Korea. It's a pleasure to share the platform with Professor Podger, who we've known one another for a long time, and he legitimates my presence here, even though I may be I've been a scholar my whole career. It's always nice to share the stage with a knowledgeable practitioner, someone who's joined the dark side of the university and later in his career. I also have to sort of express pleasure at the fact that one of our alumni from the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, Minister Wong from the Ministry of Personnel Management, is one of our alumni. And so I'm very pleased that Dr. Wong had the opportunity to welcome us all this evening. And I'm also pleased to indicate that I'm now working on a research project with KDI, so I'm pleased also to see KDI involved in sponsoring this conference. My focus this evening is on managing organizations to sustain passion for public service. I think it fits very well with the idea that's expressed as the theme of the conference, that is, embrace the future. I like to think about the ideas that I'm going to present tonight as the foundation for a new round of civil service reform. Now, I know HR professionals probably the last thing they may want to see are new reforms, but I think we've been sort of, to some extent, as Professor Podger pointed out, relying on old intellectual foundations for how we do HR, particularly in the public sector. And I want to try to lay out some ideas tonight that I think are hopefully the wave of the future, and I think the foundation for thinking about how we design our civil service systems going forward. I want to focus on 3 items here tonight in my brief time for presentation. First of all, I want to talk about some foundational principles behind the ideas I'm going to present related to civil service design. The second thing I want to talk about is the intellectual foundation, the research foundation, and to some extent I'm summarizing and synthesizing research that's been developed over the last 30 years, going back to at least 1990. But we've had sort of an explosion, as I argue in the book, an explosion of social and behavioral science insights that are fundamental, I think, to the way we need to think about human resource management and the management of our public service organizations going forward. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the principles that are laid out in the book, some of the very sort of detailed proposals across a range of HR functions that make public service central to the design of our civil service system. So I want to focus on those 3 items. So next slide, please. Let me talk first of all about the foundational principles. And interestingly, I don't present these principles directly in the book, but in sort of reflecting on what I did in the book, there are several issues, I think, that are sort of foundational to the way we need to think about HR going forward, particularly in the public context. One is this notion about sort of creating a public service ethic, and we need to support a public service ethic. Now, when I was a graduate student, and this dates back 50 years, my professors always told me that public service was different, that what brought people to public service distinguished them, and they were motivated by different foundational sort of considerations and different incentives. And so that was something I learned as a graduate student. More recently, I've sort of looked at the literature and from the United Nations Development Program and what they presented, and their argument from the United Nations Development Program is we need to recapture public passion. And they argue in their in a 2015 report from UNDP that the very important sustainable development goals that the United Nations has developed cannot be achieved unless we can reestablish a public service ethic. So part of what I'm talking about is creating or recreating a culture that's important to public service. Now that goes hand in hand with sort of with a second foundational principle, and that is that I think we ought to be thinking about public service as the wellspring, as the beginning and the end for what we're all about. And so public service, I think, ought to be central to the way we think about the world. We shouldn't be thinking about what are the best incentives and what values should we be pursuing on behalf of efficiency. The question is, how do we sort of sustain and support public service? And the third foundational principle of the book is that concepts like mission, public values, and employee needs are all central, I think, to reshaping human resources in public service organizations for the future and for redesigning our civil service system. So mission, public values, and employee needs are all important and central to thinking about public service and creating a sustainable and effective civil service organization of the future. Next slide. Now, The evidence for the arguments I make in the book are drawn from several lines of research that are distinctive not only to public administration but other disciplines. What I started doing research on 30 years ago was something what we called public service motivation. That's come to be called public service motivation in the public administration community. And since we first introduced the idea in 1990, we've had as many as 1,000 studies of public service motivation in more than 50 countries around the world. So these are not ideas that are unique only to public administration in the US where they started, but these are ideas, for instance, that have been studied at least in 50 studies in China, probably an equal number of studies in Korea, and a variety of other countries around the world, including Western and Eastern Europe. So the line of research on public service motivation is important. There's a second line of research that comes out of social psychology that's associated with public or pro-social motivation and behavior. And that also sort of looks at some of the same set of issues related to motivating people in the public service context. Another line of research that emanates from sociology and economics is research on altruism. This is other regarding behavior, and we're developing a more substantial knowledge base on all these facets. The final facet is something that comes out of the field of organizational behavior and organizational psychology that's referred to positive organizational psychology. So the ideas I synthesize in the book are based on high quality research on public service motivation, pro-social motivation, altruism, and positive organizational psychology. And so they have sort of a broad foundation across a variety of disciplines. And I believe that they are really defensive, not only defensible, but distinctive to the needs of public service organizations and the design of public human resource management systems in those organizations. Next slide, please. Now, one of the arguments I make in the book is that the emerging evidence, and the evidence is grounded in those four areas I just referred to, has two things, is characterized by two things. One is it's comprehensive. That is, if we look at the research, what we find is the research is focused on job choice decisions, incentives, job design, performance, ethical behavior, innovative behavior, collaboration, and a variety of other subject matters, all relevant to design of effective design of public civil service systems and public HR systems. That's one of the emerging characteristics from the research. The other is that the research is what I call in the book coherent. It speaks to the institutional ethos of public service. It has a sort of a consistent and coherent foundation in theory and a variety of theories, including theories from sociology, social psychology, economics, public administration, and organizational behavior. And then finally, it also has a coherence in terms of its synergy. That is, that there are a variety of mutually reinforcing ideas coming out of this research that I think are the foundation for our future human resource management systems. So the emerging inferences that can be drawn from the research, I think, are both comprehensive and coherent. And that's an important distinguishing characteristic, one that we couldn't point to from our research in prior years. Next slide, please. So how does the book argue to make public service central? And basically, the argument in the book is that across a whole range of human resource functions and a whole range of human resource disciplines, we can put a public service perspective on each one of those functions. For instance, we need to think more carefully about recruiting for individuals, recruiting and selecting individuals with high public service motivation. This is sort of the topic of the project that I'm currently involved in with colleagues from Korea and Taiwan. We need to think about the meaningfulness of public work, and we can leverage the meaningfulness of public work to motivate people across our organizations. We also need to be thinking about sort of creating environments in which that are receptive to public service. We also need to be thinking about our incentive systems and the compensation system, and that is, I think, a sort of a critical deficiency of the way we thought about public service historically, but there's a wealth of research coming out in those areas. And then finally, we also need to think about leadership and what forms of leadership are best suited and best aligned with high qualities of public service. Next slide, please. Now, in the book, in the concluding chapter of the book, I sort of go through a whole list of proposals that I present in the book. And I categorize those in 3 categories, and the next 3 slides focus on those distinct categories. And I don't have enough time to sort of deal with each one of these. But what I categorize them is I say, some of these proposals are novel. Some of the proposals focus on traditional ideas, and some of the proposals are borrowed from other fields and have not been tried extensively in the public sector. But for instance, I think we need to be thinking about explicitly selecting for public service motivation. One of the points I make in the book is that we've historically focused on selecting people for the job. We need to be thinking about not only selecting people for the job, we need to be thinking about selecting people for the organization. And selecting people for the organization will reinforce our interests and our concerns about public service. It's also likely to support our interest in developing cultures that are robust with respect to our public service interests and to the missions that our organizations pursue. Next slide, please. Now, on this slide, I sort of focus on traditional proposals, but for instance, some of the ideas like onboarding and mentoring have been around a long time, as has the idea of merit-based personnel systems. They all play a large role in putting public service at the center of our organizations and sustaining passion for public service. But we need to do them more effectively. We need to do them better, but they are clearly central to the nature of human resource systems going forward. Next slide, please. Some of the proposals, imported proposals, that again, I don't have any time to sort of devote to these, but for instance, one of the ideas that is sort of a rejuvenation of the ideas of job design related to a concept called relational job design is important for connecting people who do work with the people for whom that work makes a difference, particularly in a pro-social way. So relational job design is an important concept undergirding our design of work. Another idea that comes out of the positive psychology movement is job crafting, where individual employees redesign their work to make their work more meaningful. Another idea that I came across that I think is very important for public organizations is career counseling, where we may have people come to the work because they sort of feel that it sort of suits their interests and their identity, but we need to help them sort of make that connection. And so career counseling can be important. Next slide, please. So my conclusions in the book and my conclusions from this research over the last 30 years is that we now have an emerging intellectual capital that's created a foundation for what I refer to as a public service motivational model. And that's important for the way we sort of structure our civil service systems and our management policies and our human resource programs in the future. So I consider it to be an important foundation for the future of HR and civil service design. We have the comprehensiveness of the research indicates that it has implications for all HR functions: recruitment, selection, leadership, and compensation, among other things. And then finally, and that's my time, if I can stop it. That it has positive consequences for individuals, programs, organizations, and citizens. And that, I think, is the bottom line for us. That is, we need to sort of serve not only the interests of the individuals in our organizations, but programs, organizations, and citizens. And with that, I will stop, and I think we're ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Perry, for your comprehensive presentation on how to manage and motivate organizations and create an environment to sustain passion for public service. To have a more in-depth view on the two speeches, we will now continue with a discussion session with the two keynote speakers. This discussion will be moderated by Professor Choi Hung-seok of Korea University. Professor Choi, please allow me to hand the microphone over to you.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Andrew. Are you seeing me?
Yes, we see you.
I'm very glad to meet you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah, very glad. And then I actually have prepared two questions. One has to do with COVID-19. The other one has to do with the PSM, public service motivations. And in the interest of time, I think I'll just posit the two questions so that I think each of you can take both. And then when you feel that the time is right, we can just switch to one to the other one. And also, I'll let we have President Park and President two presidents here, so that I'll also ask them, if appropriate, if we have time to jump in, to provide some comments and questions. So my question first, that has to do with COVID-19, is going like this. And I actually feel that the COVID-19 has opened up a new kind of playground where we see some professional accountability is interacting in a rather awkward manner with political accountability. I see it in the United States, and then South Korea is no exception. And then I'm wondering how such interaction between different types of accountability are being played out in Australia. And then I also wonder, what would you think the implications, its implications for HRM at the senior executive service level? And then another question of mine that has to do with the PSM is that maybe low-powered incentives, and then to a less extent, total compensation seems more familiar in Asian countries like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, as Jim also already mentioned. In the past 20 plus years, though, it seems that South Korean public sector organizations, government organizations, and public corporations, they have been moving in a sense, in a reverse direction, from low-powered incentives to high-powered incentives. And then to some extent, from a total compensation to a rather base salary incentives. And then we already have, for example, pay-per-performance system in place. As for public corporations, we have yearly evaluation and also incentive pays. Very strict schedule based on the evaluation is paid as incentives for the people in public corporations. Then, what would you say to them? So is it too much? Maybe I think each of you can take both, but maybe we can start with the one with that has to do with the PSM. Then, when the time's right, we can jump into another issue. Maybe I'll ask Jim to respond first.
Well, yeah, I was remarking to Andrew before we started that the U.S. Civil service system has been on the General Accountability Office's high risk list for 19 years. Pay is at sort of the core of that. So one of the issues we have is that at any given point in time, the snapshot may not be particularly promising. And I think to some extent what you're describing in Korea is perhaps a snapshot of some trends. That is low-powered to high-powered incentives and total compensation to a greater focus on base salary. I don't necessarily see those as long-term trends, but I think one of the things we need to get straight, and one of the reasons I propose, although I have to admit that total compensation is not something for which we have lots of evidence, although it may be more indicative of Asian countries than it is of the US, although I know it's not indicative of Asian countries like Singapore or Hong Kong or other places to which I travel in Asia, is that we need to sort of focus on public service. And one reason I argue for total compensation, particularly in the US context, although elsewhere, is that I believe it helps put into perspective what's important or should be important. And this is to some extent a normative argument. What should be important to our civil servants or our public servants. And the beginning and end should not be how much money you can make or how high you can get your base salary. It ought to be ultimately about public service. And I think there's a propensity to lose the focus on public service when our compensation structures deviate significantly to trying to emulate, for instance, what's going on in the private sector or elsewhere, because then it sort of changes the nature of our institutions. But I think, in the U.S. we've not had sort of a straight line development related to compensation for public employees at all levels of government. So the way we sort of think about compensation today and our criticisms of it are different than what we might have said 10 years ago or even 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. I do know, though, from looking at the cross-national comparisons of base salaries and other compensation like pensions and the like, that there are relatively few countries that go sort of the straight line and are sort of on the line with respect to total compensation. They either are below levels for base compensation or above levels for base compensation, or the pensions are too high or the pensions are too low. So it's sort of hard to find a happy medium, but I think we need to redirect our attention to the sort of the total compensation perspective to be able to sort of center our public service on public service and not on the fiscal or financial rewards. Let me stop there and let Andrew sort of comment.
Thanks.
A couple
Andrew,
of comments.
would you like to have some comments on this issue of compensation and incentives? Andrew?
Sorry?
Yeah.
A few points. I think Jim's material is terribly important in its challenge of some of the theories that have been thrown around for the last 30 years about public choice, for example, and that motivations in the public service are all about self-interest and the money. I think that they have got it wrong, and Jim's put his finger on it, that it isn't just about the money. But there are a range of agendas here, and I do think it is important to have total compensation as your picture, simply because that's the resources being used, and thinking about total compensation is the right thing to do. In Australia, we played with more high-powered incentives through performance pay and performance bonuses. They began to be introduced in the early 90s. They were pushed very hard. That was by a Labor government, and then a Conservative government wanted to take it a lot further in the late 1990s, so that vice ministers, for example, like myself, were on performance pay bonus systems and contracts. But we have moved a long way from that in the last decade. There are very few performance pay arrangements now in the Australian public service, because it was found that they did not deliver the efficiencies expected, but indeed they caused unhappiness within the service. People felt that they were getting in the way of teamwork, even if that wasn't entirely true. To get them to be fair took a hell of a lot of resources. As a manager, to make sure that all my staff felt the performance pay distribution was a fair distribution took a lot of effort. and that extra effort was just not worthwhile. So we've moved away from all of that. If you want to get better performance, there are other things that are more important than the pay. Most important is that people do get their feedback. They get feedback on performance that's timely, relevant, fair, comprehensive. That what's expected of them fits with what the mission of the organisation is, that there's alignment between what's expected of the individual and what's expected of the organisation. And you can't have a performance of individuals being monitored if the supervisor isn't making the job easy. So the supervisor's got to make sure if there's somebody who's a consistent bad performer, get rid of them because that gets in the way of the other people. The supervisor's got to make sure that the IT works. So there are a whole range of things you can do to improve performance, but you don't need to have this big picture bonus system that we used to try and it did not work.
Okay, I'd like to ask, yeah, would you? I think President Park has some questions or comments. Yeah, please go ahead.
네, 저는 그냥 질문이 좀 있는데.
I do have a question.
아까 그 호저 교수님께서
So the Professor
최근
Podger,
들어서 특히 새로운
You
신기술에
mentioned
대한
that recently
부분,
the importance of new technology has been emphasized.
이제 공무원에 대한 교육을 담당하고 있기 때문에
I'm responsible for the education of public officials, so I'm quite interested in education.
신기술에 대한 그 중요성이 이제 우리
So,
공무원에서 많이
And
강조되고
I clearly feel the importance of new technologies.
교육에 대해서는
So as for the education of new technologies on public officials, is there any methodology or approach you take? You also briefly mentioned outside experts, but at the same time, the IT education and training on the internal, civil servants and officials, what is being done in Australia? You also put an emphasis on collaboration between the central government and the local government, and even between national ministries, the importance of collaboration is getting even higher. So in educating the civil servant, how do you put an emphasis on that? I have one last question.
특히 이제 뭐 저희 쪽에서는 이걸 어떻게 봐야 될까? PSM이라고 말씀을 주셨고,
You mentioned PSM, and you also mentioned ethics.
지금 우리의 경우에도 지금 계속 이제
So in our case, we have a lot of new millennials joining our organizations. And so in Korea, we also talk a lot about the values of public services that cannot be compensated financially only. The Professor Perry emphasized the importance of total compensation.
그런 부분에 대해서는 미국에서는 혹시 그
So in the United States, for this part, how do you deal with in public education?
Am I supposed to make it? Yeah. Okay, actually, President Park has a lot of questions. Three different ones. The first one has to do with the training and education of new technologies. And for example, these days, in the public sector context, they are starting to use and adopt new technologies. Maybe cloud data-related technologies. And then she was curious how the training and education of new technologies are being done in the context of Australia and the United States. And the other one has to do with collaboration. Collaboration in the context of South Korean government has been an issue. So people emphasize on it, but I feel that it is something that we can really never achieve to a satisfactory level. And then if maybe something that we can learn from the practice that is being done in the United States or Australia, she will be very glad to hear. The other one, the third one has to do with public service motivation. In the context of South Korea, they call it public values. It's a 공직가치. It's a public position, values-related public positions. So and then some of the trainings and educations are focused on increasing enhancement of those public service motivations. And then also she was curious how that the enhancement effort for public service motivation is being somehow done in the context of Australian and then the U.S. Training and educations for public servants. Could you respond to maybe the one of these three questions?
I will try my best if I may, but I want to leave room for Jim to come in as well. On the issue of training in IT, I think what we've found that over the 90s and 2000s, we contracted out a large part of our IT systems, and we've become enormously reliant on external experts. That will always be the case, our reliance on whether it be Microsoft or any of the other big companies. But what we've decided to do is to set up what we've called the professions model. And one of the professions that's going to be a key profession across the public service is in digital technology. And so we've identified a leader of that profession, and they will be both training people within the public service to be experts, but they'll also be training everybody else to be mindful of IT possibilities for themselves, so that they don't have to be an expert, but they have to be a utilizer and have to know what's available and what could be used. So they've only just started this in Australia, the professions model, and as I say, the digital side of it is one of the first cabs off the rank to try and see if we can have a big investment in the training of public servants in that profession. On the second issue on collaboration, there's been quite a lot of emphasis on joint work using project management, so a more agile way to handle issues. You can have a team from different agencies to handle an issue, and you need to train people about good project management in managing that issue as one of the important parts. But underlying collaboration is, of course, having mobility, so there's more people moving across. I think it's fair to say that in Australia we have more mobility across agencies than you would see in the United States, that we have a public service model that more senior people, it's very rare that senior people have only been in one agency, whereas that's not the case in most of the US systems. But we're talking about trying to take that further. I'm a bit nervous that you could take it too far and lose sight of the importance of technical expertise in the different missions of different agencies. But we also have invested in that I'm part of, the Australian-New Zealand School of Government. And it is a collaboration across universities in Australia and New Zealand. It's owned by the government jurisdictions, and it provides for senior people training through an executive master's program and other programs, but it trains people from the different jurisdictions working together. So it does actually help build networks in the long term because people have trained and worked together through the Australian-New Zealand School of Government. Let me stop there. Let Jim answer a bit more of the third question, but I might come back on the third question in a moment.
Well, the other point related to technology is that Professor Podger and I just collaborated on a special issue that's forthcoming in December in the Asia Pacific Journal of Public Administration, for which Professor Che is on the board. And that whole issue is going to be available online free for anyone that wants to look at it. So you can learn more about the professions model and some of the other issues related to technology management in both China and Australia. So I would encourage you to sort of pick up an issue or that issue and look at those online articles. There are 6 articles related to technology. Let me say about public service motivation that I don't see bringing people on board to be primarily the function of training. As I indicated in the book, for instance, I talk about recruiting and selecting people for the organization, not just the job. So if we want people who have a particular values stance and an ethical stance, we want to recruit the right people, and that has to sort of reflect the culture of the organization and maybe the culture of government and culture of public service. So that's one way to sort of get people on sort of the right page. Another thing I talk about in the book, in Chapter 7, I devote all of Chapter 7 to the whole issue of socialization, assuming that people may not come to public service with the right values or the values that are expected of their unit. But that change doesn't necessarily occur as a function of the training process. It may occur as a function of the mentoring process. It may occur as a function of onboarding, which is a year-long process in some organizations. And so we need to sort of think very broadly about how do we sort of draw people with sort of the right sort of ethical and service orientations together in our public organizations. Another thing that's important, I think, is the mission. And we have great examples of people who have been drawn for the right reasons to pursue particular public missions, but we want to get the right people attached to those missions. And that's not necessarily a function of training so much as it is, again, socialization and recruitment and selection. And so I think we need to think very broadly about public service motivation and people having the right values and the right ethics, and how do we draw those people in and how we sort of create what I call passion for public service in the book.
Can I add something on that issue as well? We put a lot of work some years ago into not only getting people to understand the public service values, which are actually written into our Public Service Act, but we got out material on what we called how do you embed the values. And we talked about 3 strategies for trying to embed the public service values. The first strategy is what we call leadership. That is not only senior people walking the talk, but it included ethics awareness training, a whole range of things of that sort. The second area was management. That is, all your management processes have to be entirely consistent with your values. So that would include your HR systems, your performance management systems. All those things have to reflect the values and be seen to reflect the values. And the third area is assurance. How can you be sure that you've got it there? You can do that by, for example, at the top end, making sure that people who breach the code of conduct are actually taken to task. But you can also have surveys of your staff. You can have surveys of your clients and get feedback to say, are you confident of the values being understood and being abided by within your organization?
Thank you very much. The discussion is getting more interesting, more and more interesting. But I'm very afraid that in the interest of time, we have to wrap up our sessions. To continue this interesting discussion, I think NHI should create another opportunity when the COVID-19 is over. I really thank you very much, Andrew and then Jim. Then we'll have to stop here. Then we'll be seeing you maybe hopefully sometime next year.
When the vaccine arrives.
Yes.
We hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the insightful discussion. We're sorry to stop here. This brings us to the end of the plenary session. Since we're running out of time, we would only continue within just a couple of minutes, and we will start at 10:20. Thank you very much.